My name is Andy Gillespie. I'm the executive lead for the PFAS research that we're doing in EPA's Office of Research and Development. What I'm going to do over the next 40 minutes or so is give kind of a high-level overview of all of the different research that we're doing. We've organized our research into different lines of work, but really the focus of all of this research is to generate the science that enables our partners and our clients, including states and tribes and EPA regions and program offices, to make decisions about PFAS. So to understand the sources of the risk, the relative risk, prioritize the risk, and then come up with management activities to address or mediate the risk. So let's see if I can figure out how to change my slides here. There it is.
Bottom left-hand corner. There you go.
Yep. Yeah, it's just, I'm sure everybody understands this is probably the 5th or 6th different virtual presentation platform that we've all had to become accustomed to. So I get a little rusty sometimes with Adobe. But you can see the slide with the model, the 2 diagrams of the PFAS, Lisa?
Yes.
Okay. So a quick overview of PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So it's a very large class of synthetic chemicals. All of these chemicals are manufactured. They don't occur in nature. So anytime you find a PFAS, you can be pretty sure that that chemical started its life somewhere in a chemical manufacturing facility or as a degradation product in some other process. But what all the PFAS have in common is that there's some component of the molecule which consists of a chain of carbon atoms, in this case for these 2 diagrams shown by the black circles. And then the carbon atoms are surrounded mostly or completely by fluorine atoms, in this case the blue and the green circles, which makes this chain of carbon fluorine atoms. Very large number of these chemicals are known to exist. There's over 5,000 in global commerce, chemicals which have actually been produced and registered for some purpose. And then there's probably many more that we don't know about that are just various degradation or byproducts, not things that are intentionally made, but things that happen when the more complex molecules break down. Here in the U.S., there's about 1,200 different PFAS which have been registered at one time or another on the TSCA inventory. About half of those, about 600 or so, are currently active, which means they've been manufactured, produced, imported in the last 10 years. And then again, there's also unknown PFAS chemicals that might represent various breakdown products. Because while this carbon-fluorine bond is very strong, the other parts of the molecule, and some of these molecules get very large and complex, can in fact break off. And so you can get these molecules breaking down and degrading sometimes fairly rapidly. But at every step in the degradation process, at least one of the degradation products is a new PFAS. And so the carbon-fluorine part is very, very durable. The chemistry can be very complicated. There's all these many different variations that exist in commerce, and our global industry is very innovative in how they can produce these new chemicals for different purposes. They're widely used in both industrial processes to make things, as well as used in end products themselves, consumer products, industrial products. And some of the challenges for us and for you are that these can be very mobile. These chemicals can move through multiple air and water pathways. Because of that persistence, they can move very far over time. They've been found in pretty much every part of the world. These molecules can last, we know, on the order of thousands of years for that carbon-fluorine chain. Some of these molecules are known to bioaccumulate in organisms, and they can biomagnify up through food webs, and so that if you're exposed to a consistent dose, the actual amount in your body over time can increase relative to that dose because the chemicals don't exit as quickly as they come in. And we know that at least some of these chemicals are toxic at relatively low levels. And that combination of persistence, bioaccumulation, and toxicity, we call PBT, these are often markers of chemicals which are of high concern to EPA. The PFAS chemicals have been around in the use since the 1940s in a wide array of consumer products produced in different facilities. Initially, it was a fairly small set, but over time, as chemists figured out that they could be very innovative with these chemicals, the number and the thread of the, excuse me, another phone call coming in. The number and use of the chemicals has really grown over time. Many people have been exposed to PFAS. We have national bioaccumulation, biomonitoring data that's been collected for many years, and we know that pretty much everybody in the U.S. has some level of PFAS in our bodies, and they can stay for a long time. There's evidence that some of these PFAS may lead to adverse human health effects. And so all of these factors together have made this an issue of growing concern for EPA, for some of, for example, in the states and regions and tribes, and the public. And so EPA is committed to taking action to deal with these chemicals. Now, some of the recent actions that we've taken at EPA, a couple of years ago, EPA put out a PFAS action plan, which cut across the whole agency. All the different program offices and regional offices had a hand in developing that. We identified some activities that we would undertake. I'm going to speak today mostly about the research that we're doing, but just as an initial higher level overview, these are some of the other actions that EPA has completed in the last year or two. EPA did come out with interim recommendations for addressing groundwater contaminated with PFOA and PFOS. This was put out by our Office of Land Emergency Management just last year. This provides some interim guidance recommendations for federal cleanup programs, CERCLA and RCRA. EPA, the Office of Water, has developed and validated and published a method 533 for 11 different PFAS in drinking water. Now, this is a complementary method to the method 537.1, which was led by Office of Research a couple of years ago, which focuses on longer chain PFAS chemicals. But between these two methods, EPA now has validated drinking water methods for a total of 29 different PFAS chemicals. Earlier this year, EPA put out a list of 172 PFAS chemicals that are going to be subject to the toxic release inventory reporting requirement. That data collection period starts actually this year, 2020. Companies will have to start reporting that data to EPA next year at the end of the year period. The Office of Water is working through a proposal, has made a proposal to regulate PFOA and PFOS in drinking water. That proposal was put out for public comment. They're currently responding to those comments, making their final recommendation, which will hopefully be out sometime later this year. And EPA came out with a significant new use rule, a SNOR, for certain PFAS in manufactured products. That was a few months ago. So the agency is taking action, following the legally mandated processes that we have to go through. And all of these different actions are supported in one way or another by the research that we do in the Office of Research and Development. So as far as expanding the scientific foundation for understanding and managing risk from PFAS, as you can imagine, with all these chemicals and not a whole lot known about some of them, it's a very complex problem. At EPA, when we have a complex research challenge, we often organize our approach around what we call the risk paradigm, where we break the problem down into components. And in particular for chemicals, those components are that we want to understand the toxicity of the chemicals. We also want to understand the exposure, how different people and ecosystems are being exposed to those chemicals. Because you have to have both of those things. You have to have a chemical that has an adverse effect, and then you have to have a system where you have to have people that are exposed to that chemical in order to have risk, probability of harm. Once we assess the risk and we understand really what the greatest risks are, where they're coming from, then we can identify effective treatment and remediation methods to address that risk, often by figuring out how to break the exposure pathway, since we can't really change the fundamental toxicity property of the chemical. But if we can interfere with the exposure pathway so that people are no longer exposed to the chemical, then we can manage the risk. And so EPA has a lot of different work in what I call different lines of research. These are some of the recent advances in PFAS science that the agency has made, publishing those standard methods, 537.1 and 533 for 29 different PFAS. We have a draft method, 8327, which is applicable to non-potable water, 24 different PFAS. That's being led by the Office of Land Emergency Management and should be finalized sometime in the next few months. That's what we call a direct injection method. A variation of that method is being worked on right now under the Clean Water Act by the Office of Water. This would use an isotope dilution method, which is a different laboratory analytical method, which many organizations, including Department of Defense, actually prefer to direct injection. And so this method is, we have a method, it's undergoing the single lab validation right now, and then we'll undergo a multi-lab validation to make sure that it's robust enough to be used in a regulatory framework. And we hope to have that finished probably by the end of next year with the multi-lab validation. We continue our research with high-resolution mass spectrometry. This is the use of very advanced laboratory equipment which we can use to discover new PFAS, things that we didn't know were in the environment before. We've done a lot of pioneering research with this in EPA's Office of Research and Development. We continue to develop and refine these methods. We expect that at some point, as the technology advances, that this technology will become more available, for example, to state laboratories. Right now, this is really more of a research kind of an application because it takes very expensive equipment that not many state laboratories have. But over time, the trend is the cost of these equipment comes down, and these methods should be more accessible to states in the future. In addition to the standard validated methods, which are used for agency activities, we also develop research methods. These are methods which they're still quality assured and they're peer reviewed, and we use them for our research approaches. They would not necessarily be suitable for any kind of a large-scale national regulatory monitoring program, but they're very valid, useful methods for purposes of research and analysis, including technical assistance efforts. And so we have published analytical methods for PFAS in blood serum and in estuarine waters. Over the last few years, EPA has developed a reference library, an actual physical collection of 430 different reference samples of different PFAS. Of the thousands of PFAS that are out on the market, unfortunately, we can't just go out and buy samples of these. Many of these are proprietary chemicals that are used by companies for their own purposes. So it's a much smaller set that we're able to actually procure a physical sample of. We have about 430 of these right now. And this is important because it allows us to do research, us and others to do research with the same set of chemicals, so that we're all understanding and studying the same thing. This library is available to states and other government entities if there's interest. We ask that you sign a material transfer agreement. And if you click on the link and go to the information about the library, you can find out how it's possible to essentially check out samples from our library in limited quantities for research and development use by the states. EPA maintains a HERO on a human toxicity literature database online. We have citations in there, lit search citations for 32 different PFAS right now. We should be adding to that by the end of the year. I think we've got a set of another 150 PFAS chemicals that are undergoing lit searches and should be finalized and added to that in the not too distant future. On the ecotoxicity side, EPA maintains an ecotox knowledge base. This is a data set, essentially a database with curated information about peer-reviewed literature on ecotoxicity information. So currently there's about 19,000 different entries in that data set, makes reference to 459 different species and exposures up to 130 PFAS. We add to this continuously. Every quarter there's an update with the new literature that we've been able to find and add to it. EPA maintains a drinking water treatability database. This is a collection of literature and citations and data about the effectiveness of different drinking water treatments on different chemicals of interest. This has been developed and operated for many years. It includes many more chemicals than PFAS, but we've, over the last few years, have been adding PFAS chemicals to this, adding information about both conventional as well as some newer treatment techniques, how effective they are for different PFAS under different water chemistry conditions. We have some tests underway looking at drinking water treatment, what we call point of entry filters, the kind of filter that you might put on a building or a home for the water source that enters the building. We've done some tests of granular activated carbon. We're working on some ion exchange resins. These would be applicable to systems that are not connected to a large water utility, where a building or a site or a farm or a home might be responsible for their own water treatment. And then we have technical assistance. We have a lot of collaborative projects with states, starting to have some with tribes, and where we provide different kinds of technical support for issues that are of interest to those partners. And those analytical reports are often, they're transferred by us to the state, and then the states often will post those and make those public. So the next series of slides talks about our ongoing work, the things that we're working on over the next year or two. I have a slide on each of the major, what I call major lines of research. So the first line, analytical methods. Analytical methods are really fundamental to a lot of what we do in EPA's research office. You need methods not only to identify what PFAS are existing in the field in different samples, but you need methods also to do bench scale research. So for example, the toxicity testing that we're doing, we have to analyze the chemicals that we're using to make sure that we're testing exactly what we think we're testing, that our testing methods are not somehow changing the chemical. When we're looking at the effectiveness of different disposal destruction technologies, we need to be able to measure the waste streams, sample and understand for sure which PFAS are coming out, if any at all, or what's happening to the mass balance. And so analytical methods are really a key piece of information used by many different stakeholders and used by us in research as well. And we've got efforts underway looking at developing and validating methods for PFAS in a variety of environmental media, water, air, solids, tissues. We have a method underway for looking at PFAS in air emissions and sampling. That should be posted by the end of this year under the EPA's OTM 45 protocol. This will be something that can be used to sample a stack of some kind and identify which PFAS are moving up the stack and if any are actually leaving the facility. I mentioned earlier the isotope dilution method. This is a collaborative effort with Office of Research, but also the Office of Water and the Department of Defense that's actually undertaking a lot of the multi-lab validation. In this method that we're looking at right now, the CWA 1600 method, that'll be applicable to non-potable water, so things like surface water, groundwater, wastewater, but also some water-related solids, including sediments and biosolids. So it'll be a very broad and applicable method. The single lab validation should be finished in the next few months, and then the multi-lab validation and the final publication in the latter part of next year. And we're also looking at methods for total organic fluorine. This would be a method, you could almost think of it as like a litmus test. It would just tell you that the presence or absence of some kind of organic fluorine, which implies a PFAS, in a sample. This could be very useful for screening purposes. For example, if you had a large number of samples, instead of going through the somewhat expensive process of identifying all the PFAS in all the samples, you could do a quick screen first and figure out if samples had PFAS or not, and then figure out which areas you wanted to go in and do some deeper dives and further studies. And then complementing these, what I would call targeted methods, where we have lists of analytes that we're looking for, we are continuing our research with non-targeted analysis using the high-resolution mass spectrometry to enable the discovery of new PFAS. We know that we have a very innovative chemical industry in the U.S. They're constantly creating new molecules, putting them out in the environment, either through their manufacturing process or accidental releases. We don't always know what we're looking for because much of that information is proprietary, it's confidential business information. And so the non-targeted analysis allows us to sample and identify everything that's in a sample. And then through this, we've been able to discover some novel PFAS. So the goal here, you could think of it really, is to create a toolbox, a variety of different analytical methods that could be used by different people to measure PFAS, identify it, quantify it in different kinds of environmental mediums. Chemical data curation. What this means is just the process of managing this vast body of information that we're generating about PFAS chemicals, with hundreds or possibly thousands of chemicals being studied, and many different dimensions, looking at toxicity and exposure and hazard and presence and what they're used for. It's just a very large data set. And so the physical process of just managing, curating these data to make them available, to make them useful to people, is in itself a challenge. We're spending a fair bit of time trying to organize our databases, building online tools to streamline access to PFAS data and to make it available, to make it searchable, and to make it useful, both for our own purposes as well as for our partners and customers. Some of the near-term research products we have underway here, we're developing models to predict PFAS chemical and physical properties. These are fundamental pieces of information that site managers need, for example, to decide how to remediate, how to clean up a site. Or that our chemists need to understand how to measure and identify PFAS samples. The physical chemical properties are not known for many PFAS. They're even very hard to actually physically measure in a laboratory. And so by applying some of our models to complement any physical measurements we have, we can generate information about chemicals for which we have really no other data. We're in the process of doing some high throughput toxicity toxicokinetic testing. We'll be building a public repository to load those data in. Those data could be useful to states and others, for example, who are familiar with some of the newer approach methods in toxicity assessment. They can use toxicity data from chemical assays to try to make inferences about chemical toxicity for chemicals where you have no other information. We have a public online database, EPA Comtox Chemicals Dashboard, and the ecotoxicological database called Ecotox, both of which are curating information about chemical physical properties, sources, exposures, and other things. All of these links can be found off of the EPA PFAS research webpage, which I have at the end of the presentation. And as best we can, we're trying to make the information organized and available and useful to a variety of partners to help us all make better use of the information that we're generating. Now, exposure is something that we've studied a long time. There's lots of different studies of exposures of PFAS. Many of them are situational. They're studies of a small area or a small pathway, and just a piece of the puzzle. And what we're really lacking is kind of the larger picture, broader knowledge of the nature, the sources, the extent, patent transport, accumulation, and ultimately human ecological exposures for the whole universe, for the whole part of the country that we're interested in, and for all the different chemicals. So trying to aggregate this information, trying to build databases of all the available PFAS exposure data that we can get our hands on, using models to fill in the gaps, and then developing tools for actually using that exposure data to make inferences about pathways and sources, and which of those pathways and sources are having the most impact in terms of exposures to humans and to ecosystems. Is really a challenge. At EPA, we've done work in exposure for many years. We're very experienced with a lot of different chemicals. We've built tools and data sets for other chemicals, and we're in the process now of adapting or modifying, or in some cases developing necessary new tools to deal with this large and complex class of PFAS chemicals, which sometimes move and behave in ways that are very different from other chemicals. Some of the near-term research products that we have underway, we have a case study of looking at PFAS freight and transport through air dispersion from a point source from a chemical manufacturing facility. There's actually a paper that should be published fairly soon on that, looking at one of our facilities here in North Carolina, and just taking some data which the facility kindly provided us with in terms of their emissions, using that to model through some of our standard EPA air transport and deposition models what might be happening in the surrounding region. We're developing a framework for comparative PFAS exposure analysis, and then using that to do some multimedia human exposure estimation for 6 different PFAS. And that's work which will come online hopefully by the end of this year. The goal here is really to start trying to aggregate and mine all of the information that exists about PFAS exposures, and to be able to turn it into information that's actionable, that either, for example, a program office or a state could use to inform some kind of decision that they have to make, or that a site manager could use to inform a cleanup risk management decision. Now, on human toxicity, there's really 2 different approaches that we're taking for research, because what we found is there's a very large number of chemicals, PFAS substances, for which we have next to no information about human toxicity. There's a much smaller set of chemicals where we do have a fairly well-established body of scientific literature. And so we're really taking a 2-pronged approach. For the smaller set of chemicals, and there's roughly, I would say, maybe 20, maybe 25 in the last year, PFAS chemicals where we think there is a sufficient body of peer-reviewed studies to understand human toxicity. We are proceeding with developing some of our standard agency toxicity reference values, primarily reference doses, an oral dose per kilogram body mass per day. I don't think we've yet found any PFAS chemicals where we have enough information to look at dermal or inhalation exposures. But what we do with these chemicals is we conduct a systematic review of the literature. We map the evidence that's available to try to understand which endpoints have best been studied, which animal models, what is the whole body of toxicology information, epidemiological information that might exist that links an exposure, a dose of a chemical to an adverse effect. We're adding the literature to the HERO database as we go, so it's available to anybody who's interested in these same chemicals. And doing our normal synthesis and assessment, trying to identify these standard toxicity values. For example, those of you that are familiar with the IRIS program, we have 5 of our PFAS chemicals that are undergoing the IRIS assessments right now. So some of our near-term research products, we're in the final stages of finalizing an assessment for PFBS, which is a 4-carbon PFAS chemical that hopefully will be posted in the next few months. EPA is also close to finishing an assessment for HFPO dimeracid, also known as Gen X chemicals. That's being led by the Office of Water. It's a little bit farther behind. They still have some final review steps to complete, but that should hopefully also be done in the next quarter or 2. And then we have 5 chemicals, 5 PFAS that are undergoing assessment through the complete IRIS program. Those of you that are interested in IRIS, if you go to the IRIS website, look at the latest program update, you can get a quick report on the status of those. They're in various stages of assessment, but it's covering a range of chemicals from PFBA, which is a 4-carbon, PFHXA and HXS, which are both 6-carbon chemicals. PFDA is a 10-carbon, and PFNA is a 9-carbon. And so when we complete these assessments and we add them to the 2 that already exist that EPA has done for PFOA and PFOS, which are both 8-carbon, we're going to have a range of toxicity assessments covering a spectrum of 4 carbons up to 10 carbons, which will give us some idea of whether or not there really is a relationship between the carbon chain length and the human toxicity of these chemicals. And that's one of the hypotheses that's been considered, is that the longer chain chemicals are more toxic and the shorter chains are less. We'll have some very good data to test that proposition in the coming year or two. So again, if you go to that website, you can see the status. I think the first one of these, PFEA, is getting close to first final draft. And the process would be, we develop an initial draft, we have it put out for public comment, so there's a chance for interested stakeholders to see what we've done, to comment on the approach, to provide additional studies or data sets if they're aware of those. Then we make some revisions, we put out the next draft, and that undergoes an independent external scientific peer review. We get that information back, we finalize the assessment, we have some interagency discussion with our other federal partners, and then we finalize this. And again, if you're interested, go to the IRIS website and you can learn all about the process. So this is how we're approaching research on the small set of PFAS chemicals where we have lots of existing peer-reviewed studies. For the much larger set of chemicals, hundreds to thousands, where there's limited or no existing studies, we've been applying some of our high-throughput in vitro toxicity toxicokinetic testing methods. EPA has been developing computational toxicology, high-throughput toxicology methods for the last 15 years or so. And we're using these methods now, we're applying them to try to fill in some of the gaps in toxicity information for unstudied chemicals. There's a lot of different uses of this information. We think that we can support prioritization, so we can identify which PFAS, which groups of PFAS seem to cause the most biological activity, and then stage those so that we do some more focused studies, maybe using animal models or other kinds of higher tier toxicity testing to really generate some better data. But we can also use this information for things like figuring out how to group chemicals. We know that dealing with all of the PFAS one by one is going to be a very challenging endeavor. If there are scientifically justified ways of grouping these into categories, and then dealing with a category as a single subject rather than individual chemicals, that can really speed up the research process. So grouping is important. We also have this thing we call read across, which is when you lack information about one particular chemical, but you have some toxicity information for chemicals that are somehow related, chemically, physically, structurally related. You can make inferences about what the toxicity might be for the unknown chemical based on what you know about similar related chemicals. And then looking at relative toxicity and mixtures assessment. We know that PFAS often actually occur in nature as a mixture. They're very seldom exposed just to a single PFAS chemical. And so trying to get some general information that we can use to start making inferences about mixtures would be very helpful. And then using this information for new approach methods, NAMs. This is a growing field in toxicology, trying to use some of this high throughput in vitro information to make informed hazard characterization and prioritization, to do things like what an IRIS assessment does, perhaps with a different kind of data set. So we have several different products that are underway. We have a risk-based testing strategy that we've developed using the high throughput results. That should be out later this year. We're conducting an experiment right now where we started with a set of 150 different PFAS. It wasn't a random sample. These were selected from our library at 430. They were deliberately selected to represent as much of the chemical, physical, structural diversity in that chemistry set as we could reasonably accomplish in 150 chemicals. So you could think of it as a purposive sample where we collected a few chemicals from a large number of different groups, just trying to cover the whole universe of PFAS that we have access to. Unfortunately, some of those chemicals were not amenable to the kind of technologies that we use for this high throughput work. The chemicals just didn't work in our system. They're too sticky, or they volatilized, or they didn't dissolve properly in the solvents. And so after adding some chemicals, we had to kick some out. We have a set of about 120 that we're confident we've actually been able to run through our different assays. And we've got 7 different collections of assays. Each assay has multiple endpoints. And so at the end of this experiment, we're going to have, you could envision a very large matrix, a large table of data, 120 rows, one for each chemical, and hundreds of columns for all of the different assays and endpoints. And each column tells you whether or not that particular chemical was biologically active for that particular assay, or whether that chemical did something of interest. And then by mining that data set, by exploring it and seeing what patterns show up, we think that we will be able to generate some information about which kinds of chemicals, which structures, which categories are causing which kinds of biological effects, and maybe some chemicals that cause no effects that we were able to measure. And this will really help us to inform this work about categorization, read across, and prioritization for some of the higher tiered tox testing. So in addition to human toxicity, we're also interested at EPA in ecological toxicity. In particular, what's really relevant for us here is knowledge about the bioaccumulation and ecotoxicity of PFAS of concern, particular sensitive species. So we have a lot of experience and expertise in ecological toxicity over the many years of work at EPA, not just in the Office of Research, but also in some of our program offices. We're applying this expertise now to the issue of PFAS. Some of the near-term actions is we want to try to identify which taxa, which species are the most sensitive to PFAS. We want to try to quantify rates of bioaccumulation in organisms as well as through food webs, food chains, and to support the establishment of effects benchmarks and thresholds. So, for example, to support our program office colleagues in the Office of Water who are trying to establish aquatic life criteria for different PFAS. We do the science that helps them do that analysis. We're also looking at developing PFAS-related adverse outcome pathways, AOPs. You can think of an AOP as a conceptual model. So a molecule enters an organism, causes some kind of effect at the molecular level, which translates to a cellular effect, which translates to an organ effect of an organ, and which ultimately affects the health not only of the animal, but perhaps of a whole population of animals. So trying to understand that pathway is a way that we can articulate how chemicals are affecting organisms. And the reason that's important is because if you can establish a pathway, you can establish a mechanism by which a particular molecule causes some kind of an adverse outcome, then when you find other molecules that trigger the same initial event, you can have make some inferences about the likeliness of whether or not you'll get the same adverse outcome. So it's just a way of doing some research that helps, again, group chemicals and classify them in terms of the tests, in terms of the outcomes that they might have on the organism. And this will help us fill in some of those gaps for the chemicals where we don't have a lot of information on ecological effects. So some of the near-term research products, we have a review, a synthesis of PFAS bioaccumulation literature underway. This is a precursor to trying to develop or update some of our existing PFAS bioaccumulation models, because we know that PFAS, they behave differently in organisms than many of the other chemicals that we're familiar with. They bioaccumulate differently. For example, they can be taken up by proteins rather than by lipids. And so some of our old models that are useful for other chemicals are probably not going to be as useful for PFAS. So we need to update the parameters and make sure that they actually fit. We're also looking at some of these adverse outcome pathways for a couple of very well-known pathways that are suspects for PFAS impacts, in particular PPAR signaling, where we're looking at fish, and thyroid pathways, looking at avian animal models here. And then trying to update bioaccumulation factors for PFAS in aquatic species. This information is useful not only for ecological toxicity, for making inferences about ecosystems, but we know that the ecological food webs often come up and impact human food webs. For example, eating fish or communities that rely on some kind of subsistence, either agriculture or hunting. This is a way where ecological PFAS can actually make its way into the human food chain and impact humans as well. And also the issue of AOPs. Many of these pathways by which a chemical can impact an organism are conserved across species. And so the same pathway that affects, for example, a fish or a bird might actually be a pathway which also affects humans, and vice versa. So by sharing information, by working together across the eco-human spectrum, a lot of this information can be leveraged into informing a broader set of questions. Now moving to the risk management side. So EPA does a lot of drinking water treatment research for many years. We have a center of excellence in Cincinnati, Ohio, which has worked with many different chemicals. They're applying that expertise now to the issue of PFAS. They're collecting as much performance and cost data from different drinking water treatment configurations and different ranges of systems as they can. They collaborate with utilities, they collaborate with industry, with Department of Defense, academia, and in international collaborations. Anybody who's building and operating a PFAS water treatment system who's willing to collaborate with us can contribute data to our collections. We will augment that data with bench and pilot scale testing to fill in the gaps so that we can better understand how different kinds of treatment technologies are effective or not effective for different PFAS, for different mixtures of PFAS, and under different water quality conditions. We're doing some testing primarily focused on granular activated carbons and ion exchange resins, which are two of the most broadly used PFAS drinking water treatment technologies. And all of this information will be aggregated into our online databases and tools, the Drinking Water Treatment Performance and cost models, the drinking water treatability database, so that we can make this information available, in particular to utilities, to people that have to make decisions about investments, about what kind of equipment to install for their specific drinking water treatment challenge, and how to operate it over time and what the costs might be. As we do this work, we take a life cycle approach. And we're interested not only in the system for treating the drinking water, but what do you do after 6 months of treatment when you've removed PFAS from the water, but it's now all in the granular activated carbon or the ion exchange resin. Because of the persistence, because these molecules are very durable, we have to be very careful how we manage that, what is now a waste stream, so that we don't just re-enter that PFAS into the environment in some other place. And so we're looking at some of the technologies that are used for regenerating or disposing, primarily the spent granular carbon or the spent ion exchange resin. After it's been contaminated by PFAS, what's the proper way to either dispose it, regenerate it, to make sure that the PFAS get sequestered, contained, or ideally destroyed, so that they don't become a problem in the future. In addition to drinking water treatment, we also have a lot of interest in cleaning up contaminated sites, site remediation research. We have work underway to try to characterize different PFAS sources which contaminate different sites. So understanding the difference, for example, between AFFF firefighting training sites versus manufacturing production facilities for PFAS or different disposal sites. Each of these presents a different challenge in terms of site remediation and cleanup. We're looking at different technologies for remediating PFAS-impacted soils and waters and sediments, and trying to generate the basic performance and cost data that would be used by a site manager to make good decisions about which remedies, which tools are best for cleaning up a particular contaminated site. Much of this work is done in collaboration with the Department of Defense through their CERTIC program. They have some similar interests, making some significant investments in helping to clean up, figure out ways to better clean up DoD-impacted sites. And a lot of the research that they're doing is very translatable to other kinds of cleanup situations. So some of the near-term research products, we're looking at groundwater remediation performance and cost models, looking at thermal treatment of PFAS-contaminated soils, PFAS state and transport from land application of biosolids. I know this is an issue of interest to a lot of states, especially in the Northeast, where we know that wastewater treatment plants are often the receptors for different streams of PFAS waste, and that PFAS can often migrate into the biosolids, and then when it gets applied to land, it can cause a problem in terms of moving from the land into the soil, into the water, and just perpetuating these chemicals. And so trying to understand the process, not only how PFAS can move through biosolids into the land application, but also to figure out ways of extracting or destroying the PFAS in the biosolids is an important line of work that we're doing. And then we've recently started some work looking at the potential for PFAS to be an issue in vapor intrusion. There's been a lot of research over the years on other kinds of contaminants that move through groundwater streams and become vapor intrusion problems in buildings. And we're looking at the possibility of whether and how much PFAS falls into that same category.
Hi, Andy. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to let you know you're 4 minutes over time right now.
Oh, okay. I'll try to speed it up then. I'm sorry. I thought I had until the hour. Okay, PFAS disposal is a very large topic of research that we've started doing recently, looking at characterizing the end-of-life disposal streams. What are the effective ways of destroying, disposing, making sure that PFAS, once we've gathered it in some manner, or we have it in a waste stream, does not re-enter the environment. Again, this is something I know which is of very high interest to the states. We have a lot of work underway right now, which will be talked about later in the symposium, about some of the projects we're doing, looking at incineration, looking at destruction or treatment of PFAS in landfills, and learning at different ways of thermally treating or using other technologies to figure out ways of managing PFAS. One of the special projects we have underway right now is the PFAS Innovative Treatment Team, which is a group of researchers taking a kind of a skunkworks approach. They've been working full-time for the last few months, looking at different innovative technologies, things that haven't necessarily been part of the mainstream, but which are potential technologies that might be used in specialized situations, trying to build a toolbox for how we might dispose of or manage different treatment waste streams. There's a link here to the Innovative Ways to Destroy PFAS Technical Challenge. This is a competition that we're putting out right now, trying to generate some new ideas about PFAS destruction. This slide, number 17, talks about some of our extramural research. Mostly of what I've talked about so far has been in-house work, but we also provide a lot of funding to outside partners through various competitive processes. We have a set of grants called the National Priorities Grants, 2 of which the last 2 years have focused on PFAS and water quality, water availability, and rural communities and agriculture. Recently, last year, EPA put out a STAR grant, which awarded 8 different awards for PFAS waste management, including landfills and destruction, and then the technical challenge, which I just mentioned. We have a lot of collaboration across the federal government, looking at the National Toxicology Program, which works with us here in North Carolina on some of the high-throughput tox testing. We've worked with Food and Drug Administration and USDA on analytical methods, trying to make sure that we have methods that can follow PFAS from the environment into agricultural systems and potentially into the U.S. food supply to the extent that that happens. A lot of work underway with Department of Defense, looking at analytical methods, treatment remediation approaches. States and utilities have been very strong partners, testing and applying PFAS in sampling and measurement and looking at some novel situations. We learn a lot from those collaborations, and I think they're beneficial to the states as well. And then the academic community through these extramural grant efforts, which I just mentioned. I think Jennifer touched on a couple of our state technical assistance efforts. We find these hugely valuable because we get to work with some very good technical people in the states. In some very specialized situations, we can often leverage resources, share the cost of collecting data, analyzing the data. And it's led to some, I think, some useful work to the states, but also some things that have been very useful for EPA that help us advance our science. And so we're very appreciative of that. We've done a lot of work in North Carolina, in particular with some of our non-targeted high-resolution mass spec works. Jennifer, I think, mentioned the work we've done in New Hampshire, and we've also done similar work in New Jersey, working with the state to identify PFAS in different environmental media. And then a project recently up in the Lake States, Michigan, Minnesota, looking at chrome plating, trying to understand how PFAS were escaping from some facilities where the industry had made some significant investments trying to stop that from happening and couldn't figure out why it was continuing. All of our data and tools we make available on our website. So here are the links. You can go to EPA's PFAS homepage. We have a specific subsection of that for research. And then this third link here looks at the status of EPA research and development. So all the different projects that I talked about, you can kind of see where they are in the system in terms of progress. And so I'll wrap up there. Apologies for going over. And this is my contact information. If anybody would like more information, feel free to reach out to me. But many of the things that I talked about will be getting deeper dives in the next 2 presentations today and the presentations next week. Thank you for your time.